Let's go ahead and start this meeting of Board of Directors of Templeton Community Services District. Today, this is a special meeting. Today is Thursday, May 28th. It's 12 p.m. All right, let's go ahead. Do roll call, please.
Director Cardonish.
Here.
Logan is absent.
Here.
Peterson is absent and Tyrone. Here.
Okay, so we have three board members here, so we have a quorum, so we could go ahead and continue. Let's please stand for pledge of allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please proceed. Okay, so we had a closed session at the end of our last meeting, so I'm gonna go ahead and report out of this closed session. The Board of Directors directed staff to incorporate in the draft fiscal year 2026-27 budget a cost of living adjustment equal to the consumer price index for the past 12 months, which was 3.68% for all full-time classification at Templeton TCSD. And further, to incorporate a 2.5% adjustment to classification recommended for adjustment of 6.7 to 7.06% and a 5% adjustment to the classification recommended for an adjustment of 9.4% in the 2026 RGS compensation study. These adjustments will be formally considered as a part of the budget adoption following the public hearing on June 16th, 2026. So that was our closed session decision. Order of business. Right, we're just gonna leave that and as is. Public comment, are there any public comments that are not related to items that are within our jurisdiction but not on the agenda today? There's no public comments, okay. We move to the consent agenda. We have two items on the consent agenda. We have resolution number 08-2026, which is CFD annexation number 18. And the second item is authorization to attend General Manager Summit. Any questions or comments on those two items from the board members? No? Okay. Then public, any questions? No? All right. I'll bring it back to the board. I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll make a motion that the board approve the consent agenda.
Okay. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Great. Roll call, please.
Directors Tyrone. Aye. Mortensen.
Aye.
Logan is absent and Peterson is absent and Cardonish.
Aye. All right, business item, budget workshop. So this will, we will hold a budget workshop to discuss the proposed draft for 2026-27 fiscal year budget. And General Manager, you have some highlights for us to go over?
I do. Just thank you much. So we passed out today this little budget highlight sheet that I'll walk you through this afternoon. And you should have received a copy of the budget electronically or a hard copy on Tuesday afternoon of the budget document. Just as a reminder, the line items for all of the funds were reviewed of this document were reviewed by the Finance and Admin Committee approximately a month ago. There have been a couple of changes that I'll make sure to note today based on newer information. But that committee recommended that the budget be developed with those line items. This is a nearly complete draft. The only item that's missing from the document in front of you is the transmittal letter, which can be updated between now or will be provided at the time of your public hearing in a couple of weeks. I guess that's about 2.5 weeks out still. If there's consensus by the board to make any changes to the budget, We can incorporate that into the version that's presented on June 16th. You know, traditionally, there hasn't been too many changes that the board's asked to make during the workshop, but if you'd like to, we're happy to incorporate those for your June 16th budget adoption. There's a notice public hearing for that meeting. There's a few items that the board will have to address before adopting the budget. They have to also have a public hearing concerning recruitment efforts and vacancies. So that's been noticed as well. And so at that meeting, there'll be after the public hearing, you can consider formally adopting the budget. The budget needs to be in place prior to expenditures that occur from July 1st forward. Again, I'll try to go, since all of you have been through this at least once and some more than once. I'll go through the highlights or the items that I wanted to call to your attention. But if there are any questions about anything specifically, let's just stop along the way and make sure we can cover it. We've got a representation from all of the folks who helped put this together here today. And our goal is to make sure that you get fully informed based on the draft document before you leave at the end of the day. So some overall comments that affect the budget in the big picture. Asset replacement and cash reserves from the strategic financial policies are fully incorporated into all of the funds. The summary of fund balance is shown on pages 8 and 9. 9 being the current fiscal year, 25-26, 8 being the year of the budget, 26-27. So it's a place that you can look and kind of see a snapshot of the district as a whole. All the transactions between the funds are reflected here. And this is really the only place that you can see certain revenue estimates. For example, the capital funds we've estimated and included here. We don't have a detailed sheet for each capital fund, but the revenues are estimated here. And one thing that sort of changed is we estimated our capital revenues, particularly on the water and on the water fund side, is for the past 6 years. We've assumed that every water unit that was released would be purchased, and so we've estimated revenues associated with those water units. Since we've fully satisfied the wait list and have water units available, we've only included in the fund those units that are associated with payment plans. Additionally, I want to point out on the next page, you can see on page 9 for the current year, you can see that for the water fund in particular, the water capital that's labeled NACI, that's a portion of the capital funds that's going towards the debt service by NACI, and it has a negative figure. That's because we had more refunds than purchases in revenue for the current year, the year that's ending. So if that pattern continues, which it could, the same thing could happen next year. We've not reflected that. We've not predicted a volume of refunds, but as you know, we have folks that are in payment plan agreements that have provisions to get out of those, and then also a relinquishment procedure that's likely going to change, and that may trigger some additional refunds. Anyhow, that's why those figures are shown in the negative. As the board president just announced, we have incorporated the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, into the wage schedule that's shown on page 11. So this now incorporates the wage direction from the last meeting, as well as those other adjustments to 6 classifications that were at 2.5% and 5%. There are no changes to the part-time wage schedule, which is shown on page 12. That was updated as recently as last December when there was a minimum wage increase that took effect January 1st. So it remains the same as is today. Just because it affects all of the funds, interest income, estimated interest income at about 3%. We're actually doing a little better than that, I'd say at the very moment. But you know, our investments are tied up into some older investments that produce less than 3%. And then you know, right now we're doing a little bit better than that, so they're probably conservative. There is one fewer full-time employee or position allocation in this proposed budget than was approved last July. We had a full-time maintenance worker assigned to parks in the July 1st, 2026, I'm sorry, July 1st, 2025 budget. That position went vacant in December, and we've been filling it with a part-time position since, and have allocated funds to maintain a part-time person, a little more than 50% of a full-time full-time employment. Health insurance costs are estimated to increase by 10% in January 2027. We won't get a sense of what the health insurance rates are through CalPERS until July. And then those rates will become approved or likely to be approved by September, and we'll have hard figures then. I do want to note that even though we've allocated a 10% increase in all funds for all positions for health insurance, one for employees hired after after May of 2014, which is the 90% of our employees at this point. The board would still has control of the health insurance contributions. If you wish to adjust it further, you'd have to approve a resolution to do so. And then further, that these estimates can change quickly because folks during open enrollment or at other times can, depending on the circumstances, can make changes to their election, and that can have a pretty big impact on health insurance costs in if folks like go from employee only or not taking health insurance to covering their whole family. That could be a swing of like $15,000 for one employee. Across the board, we've increased vehicle O&M expense estimates for next year for the 26-27, the budget year we're talking about, due to the fuel prices that went up here since March. So we just sort of bumped those up a little bit. If fuel prices remain as high as they are now through the entire fiscal year, we may have to consider further adjustments in that area. Difficult to predict what that cost is going to be. On page 13, you'll see the property tax forecast. This was obtained from San Luis Obispo County, I believe in February is the last time we got an estimate from the county. They've typically provided updates to the estimate on a couple of occasions during the course of the year. And if we get a revised projection, we can incorporate that into the mid-year budget review. And again, typically, the estimates have gone up. So this is still a good conservative figure. We've been able to beat it each year. But it's the latest information available through the county. The property tax split remains the same as it has for several years, and it's shown on that same page. 72.125% property taxes obtained with the fire fund, 1.75% to street lights, 26.125% to parks and recreation. It was completed last summer, so it should be, yes, it should be included in the.
Was it the Twin Cities? Is that what you were saying?
No, the Camarillo Hotel. Yeah, it's been.
Yeah, that should be there.
Yeah, that should be reflected. Yeah. The administrative allocation is based on your adopted strategic policies, shown on page 14. I will note that a couple of things. One, the amount of money that's allocated, the portion of the admin fund, we can go into more detail when we get there, is up about $150,000, so pretty significantly. However, more than half of that is all due to the PERS UAL and a change that we made in the budget about how to account for that. So we pulled out the UAL costs from the departments that were paying in the past. So that created savings to the fire fund, primarily into the Parks and Recreation Fund. And those costs are now in admin and then divided up amongst all the funds. Additionally, you can see there, the percentage allocations, there were some minor changes, increased percentage allocation to water, a decrease to fire of about 1.25%, and some other kind of very minor changes. A very small, about 0.1% increase to Parks and Recreation. Again, as a result of the prior year's final financial performance, and again, that'll be updated annually. So these numbers will be dynamic, although I don't expect to be, really rapid changes, but over time, you can see changes. And again, stop me at any point. We will keep the historical data maintained, just because it's kind of interesting. It's very difficult to obtain accurate estimates of population for the TCSD boundaries. And we're using a new tool. It's shown here, but this is actually picking up the population of the water service area, which is a little bit larger than the boundaries, than the TCSD boundaries proper. We serve water, particularly on the northwest side to the Clausen Ranch, and the area kind of behind Target. They're served by TCSD for water service, but they're not in the district's boundaries proper. But it's not a very high density area, but likely reflects a couple hundred folks. The GAN limit is on page 16, has been provided. It's for information purposes only, that because of the district's, the year we were formed, we're exempt from the classification, but still have to provide, exempt from the limitation, but still have to provide the calculation. And then our engineering services, Lori and Tasha, primarily. Those are not separately appropriated. Those costs are contained primarily in water and wastewater, but are shown here for information purposes. All right. If you're ready, I'll just keep right on going. The water fund these are not in order of importance, but just the fund numbers assigned in the general ledger. The water fund begins on page 19. The line items begin on page 27. Just highlight a couple of things. The revenue forecast is, we've had some minor swings up and down in terms of overall user fee revenue, really dependent on water usage, how wet a year was. And last year we were very kind of cool. You might recall kind of a very cool spring and summer, or moderate, I guess you'd say, comfortable. So we're expecting a slight increase. That seemed like that was a bit of an anomaly, even though we don't necessarily have a lot of additional connections. This year we saw increased water usage in the spring with our warm weather, and then now it's raining. So hard to tell. The water fund, there's funding that funding remains for a portion of the permit and compliance specialist position, which is currently filled. That was a position that we had historically. Currently filled with a part-time office assistant. Most things are fairly steady. And again, please let me know if you have questions. We can attempt to answer them on these line items, but I'll just point out a few things that are kind of different or unique. The one is that we've added a new general ledger code for water meters and parts, and those were previously combined with repair and maintenance, and it became somewhat. We think this will be more useful for the staff to be able to track separately meters or meter specific repair and maintenance items, either replacement meters or parts to meters or new meters, etc. Funding remains for the water efficient landscape retrofit and water softener, replacement program at, $10,000. We don't have a lot of, users of that program. But continue to fund it. The master plan, and again, we awarded a water and wastewater master plan just a little over a year ago, project, and we're progressing right along, a little further along on the water side than the wastewater side. This $20,000 is estimated, is expected to be the finishing touches of the water half. $5,000 is programmed to complete the urban water management plan. That was something that we started late last year, and it's actually in draft form now, available on our website, and there's a public hearing for that item at your June meeting, and there'll be a following that meeting, there'll be some filing and some reporting that needs to be done that may take us into next fiscal year. An item that you haven't seen in a while, a more significant expense associated with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency is, as you know, we're partners with the Atascadero Mutual Water Company, City of Paso Robles, City of Atascadero, and some other smaller water providers in the Atascadero Basin. And we're due for what's called an update to this, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. The GSA is pursuing what sort of a lesser effort called a 5-year periodic evaluation, but we pay about 20% of those costs. So there's funds in here. It should come in a little less than $50,000, but some other new items, and please, again, some of these, if you have questions, both Lori and Justin are here. Probably this first one, I'll say, ask Justin. The $6,500 is half the cost. This is shared with wastewater for a replacement chemical spray trailer. We own a trailer that we can drag behind a pickup truck or a tractor that's used to spray herbicides or pesticides or other liquid agents. And the trailer's just seen better days. It has some leaks.
I'm sorry to go. Just going back to the GSA, the 50,000, does that include the annual report as well, or is that?
So I listed this as a one-time cost, so the annual costs are included in the not broken out in the single year items, but the $50,000 is actually more than enough to cover our annual.
That's what I thought.
At the time when we developed the figure, we didn't have a.
Yeah, it's 116.
Yeah, it didn't have that.
Yeah.
That cost.
Should cover both. Okay. Sorry about that.
So again, the chemical spray trailer, $40,000 is programmed to cover the completion of the Platts River well design. That is nearly designed. I think and Lori can clarify, but I think we're kind of past the 60% design point on the above ground work.
We're between 60 and 95% on the above ground, and we're for there's kind of two parts: the drilling of the well, development of the well. First part, we have all the plans and specs, and I'm hoping to go out to bid actually this week with a deadline of July 2nd, right before the July 4th holiday. So that after that first phase goes, and then we'll go into our next phase, which will likely be in the next financial year. So that's the bigger number.
Yeah, so we've got $2 million programmed for the actual construction of the well itself and all the related facilities. And this cost has crept up pretty significantly, although you certainly haven't awarded it yet. We'll have more details as the design's finalized. It's a rather large site that we're incorporating some improvements for the Platts deep well as well, in terms of security, fencing, and then a number of facilities to tie those two wells together. It's going to operate quite a bit differently than the old Platts River well, and we weren't able to utilize any of the facilities associated with that old well because the well's being relocated, several hundred feet to the north. So that's become a pretty significant project. Again, somewhere in the 60+% design phase at this point. So,
And that's on the 40,000 is on the water, or is it in?
Yeah, I noticed
I'm
that
sorry?
too. They're split, the 40,000 is in design on the list. So we have a Platts River well on page 29. There's a Platts River well design
Okay.
item, it's 40,000, and then on page 28, there's the Platts River well construction.
Yeah.
So they
okay.
broke it out to two line items.
and the design's been approved. I mean, that's a carry forward amount. It won't be
Yeah,
completed.
that's been the one that we've been working on for quite a few years.
The next item is also an item that was previously budgeted. That's the addition of a locker, kind of a locker room for the wastewater treatment plant. We had a line item last year for that, but we're unable to procure this modular facility for that price, and so the cost is significantly more. This is split between water and wastewater, but it's together $110,000. This is the next item, so I'm gonna move on to the next. I don't have page numbers on this, I apologize. The next item is to replace our hydrometers. This was another item, another line item that we had budgeted last year. But as we got into this process, realized that simply replacing the hydrant meters was gonna be insufficient in the long run. That we're gonna be required to provide backflow prevention devices on the hydrometers, and so we did move forward and have now programmed in sufficient funds to replace the hydrometers with a unit that's gonna have both a backflow prevention device and a new meter. And there'll likely be some other sort of policy related changes that'll come forward, like the TU relating to hydrometers, just so we get out of providing those in a long-term fashion and better protect the inventory of these. These are turning out to be pretty expensive units. $25,000 to replace water mains that are seized or no longer operational as they're identified, but we have some previous ones have been identified. Nearly $400,000 programmed to complete the Nacimiento turnout relocation design. It's really more than a design, it's also acquisition of right of way and some other components for environmental work. That's all being done by the county. And that project is expected to be completed, or the design component, sometime around the end of the year. Related, very much related, is the district's portion of that effort for the Nacimiento Recharge Recovery Project or site. That's also in the midst of the current design, and the remaining funds necessary to complete that, about $164,000 is programmed. That work is being led by the district, and we hired MKN earlier, last summer to do that work. It's being done with the same project with the Platts River well replacement design. $10,000 is programmed to complete the Fortini well rehabilitation. You know, that's been something we've been working on for the past couple of months. And it's expected to be mostly complete by the end of June, but there may be a few items that carry into the next fiscal year. So the water fund, if you evaluate the ongoing revenues and transfers compared to the ongoing expenses, about $482,000 to the good. So again, building up additional funds there. However, once you factor in the one-time expenses, it's reduced to about $370,000 to the good. Keep in mind that we have some projects on the horizon that are going to trigger additional long-term expenses that are probably not well stated with those figures. For example, when we book the Platts well, let's say the Platts well really does cost $2 million. Now we're going to have a pretty substantial, like a $40,000 a year additional asset replacement that hits the books for that. So these figures are continue to be in flux. Any questions on water? Moving on to wastewater, page 30, line items, actually begin on page 37. Very, similar levels of, user fees. Again, our wastewater fees are, for residential customers are flat, so they don't vary much. Commercial customers vary a little bit based on their water usage, on the wastewater side. Most other revenues are similar to the prior, years. And actually, most of the operational line items are quite similar to what you've seen over the past couple of years. I'll call out again and just kind of discuss some of the one-time expenses. Some are significant. And this first one, I wanted to make sure you that we went over thoroughly. This is one line item that changed from the what was discussed or presented to the Admin and Finance Committee in late April. We had a placeholder figure for new permit compliance support. That's really utilizing some consulting services as we make good on the new requirements for the regional board. And when I say consulting services, these are not design changes for their wastewater plant or physical improvements to the wastewater plant. They're reporting requirements to the regional board and some changes to the way we report information to the regional board. They've given us kind of a deadline of items that need to be complied with going forward, and several of them occur in this first next many months. This is somewhat subject to change. If our permit gets revised, then perhaps some of these items would slide, but nonetheless, we had a lower figure in here back in April, but in talking to the folks that we're currently working with, they estimated about $130,000 effort. So we've increased the budget to account for that. We do not yet have a contract in place for that service. Right now, we're kind of working on more of like a T&M basis as we work through some of the dialogue with the regional board. Just like the water master plan, there's $40,000 program for the wastewater master plan. This is the same effort. It's gonna roll into next year, and on the wastewater side, it's a little behind the water side, so it's more of the effort falls later. $125,000 is programmed to initiate the design of the west side force main upgrades. This project had a line item last year, but we didn't initiate any of those expenses. And it's somewhat contingent. I think we're expecting this to still remain one of the first or higher priority items to initiate on the wastewater collection system, but the capital improvement program for the wastewater side hasn't been developed yet through the master plan effort. $50,000 is programmed to replace an aerator at the wastewater plant. We always want to make sure we have aeration available on kind of on-site, ready to go. So if we lose an aerator, we can immediately replace it and then work to get the failed aerator repaired or replaced without having to lose that treatment capacity. $10,000 is programmed to replace a pump at the Grenache lift station. I think this is actually replacing a pump that we had on the shelf that we already installed at the lift station. So a redundancy request. The same chemical spray trailer is discussed a few moments ago. The modular locker room that was discussed a few moments ago. We do these.
I have a question on that locker room. Do we account for any permitting? Add it a little bit.
Yeah, but you have to go back through and see as far as permitting goes and costs associated. We were planning to tie it in ourselves into our treatment plants. The sewer line running right through the wastewater treatment plant, the water connected to the building, to the plant shop, if you will. And so, as far as any sort of,
And it might be exempt from permit, so there's something to.
Yeah.
Before we jump in.
yeah,
Okay, that was just thought when I said, oh, are we not to cover? Yeah.
3-year project.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too, timeline.
We were hoping when we were getting into this as an interim, a means and ways to improve the employees' health and safety, having this locker shower room as an interim means of being able to take care of them and
Not on a foundation.
develop something, internal perhaps to the shop, capitalize on some of that existing square footage inside of the shop to use as a locker room, shower room, moving forward long term. So this was just something in the interim.
We have an $80,000 line item that's programmed to do some manhole coating. This is related to a project we did a couple of years ago where we had, I'm gonna say maybe about approximately half the manholes from the discharge of the West Side Lift Station to the wastewater treatment plant repaired. This would repair or recoat approximately the other half. And this is at the very tail end of the collection system. And then I do want to make sure that we adequately discuss this. It's a significant item, and this won't be the last time you see this because of its costs, but there's $450,000 programmed to rehabilitate the West Side Lift Station. And I wanted to make sure that you have a good understanding of some of the challenges we face there. That lift station was not reconstructed when we did the East Side Force Main. It was modified to accommodate the East Side Force Main, and we utilized the existing Force Main line and again modified the lift station. When the lift station was modified, it was modified to the specs of the pumps that we chose. And those pumps they're big. They're our workhorse. That's our workhorse facility, right? Like maybe 90% of the district's wastewater flows through that lift station, maybe 95%. And those, I think it was probably just sort of a bad design. Just the normal usage of the pumps have broken loose some of the way that the pumps attach to the lift station itself, the walls of the wet well, and it looks like we need to do a pretty significant redesign of the way that those pumps are installed, and kind of reinstall them and not continue to repair the existing hardware. So Justin's obtained this sort of back of the napkin budget figure to design and actually do the work of the lift station, but it is pretty significant, and a lot of the costs associated relate to bypass pumping. You know, take down both the pumps and actually we've got to pump around essentially the lift station. We did this same effort when this work was being done originally, and it is costly to do this bypass pumping, renting the equipment, running temporary lines to essentially go around the lift station. So that is not this I want to make sure that you're all clear. This $450,000 is not an enlargement of the facility. This is not related to the upgrades to the West Side Lift Station in terms of a capacity issue or the force main. Simply, it's needed to continue to keep the lift station in good operating condition, and it is a pretty we do pose a lot of risks. We have so much wastewater flowing through there, given our size. Again, 90 or 95% of the wastewater flows through there. Failures at this lift station present a pretty significant risk in terms of sewer spills and our ability to manage a long-term outage. So we want to get this work done before that occurs. And obviously, because of the costs are what they are, this would likely come back to you for a budget award once the design is complete. The contractor, we get bids from contractors. Questions on that? I know it's a big ticket item. Okay, when you evaluate the wastewater fund in its entirety, if you exclude the one-time costs, we've got about $926,000 to the good. Again, we're building up cash in the wastewater fund. That's really important, as we consider kind of our long-term, needs. And then, when you factor in the one-time costs, about $700,000, to the good for the current fiscal year, for the fiscal year under study or next fiscal year's budget.
For both water and wastewater, when do you foresee us needing to do like a revenue rate study basically? Or are we gonna do that, or do we just estimate, let's raise the rates 2%, 3%? I mean, I just.
So right now,
wanna
we're
get
bringing
your
in
thoughts
more, right now, we're bringing in more revenue than we're currently using for operations. But as a part of this wastewater master plan, we're gonna end up with new, essentially an updated or a new project list. And once we can break down those projects by how each will be funded, we can incorporate those into the rate evaluation. So probably in 2027, as soon as, perhaps a year from now, you'll have enough information to determine whether it's necessary to update the rates right away.
Yeah.
Part of it is, we're gonna be facing, like, for example, this $450,000.
Yes.
It's gonna come out of asset replacement. So you're gonna have to repay the asset replacement account, so it's gonna drive up the cost of the operating side. That one item isn't gonna, you've got a lot to work with. On the wastewater side, it's more concerning. Because once we get a much better sense of what it will take to meet the new permit requirements, again, some of those requirements it's been issued, but there's continued dialogue. Once we know what those requirements are, we can work with our team to develop possible solutions. And actually, we're supposed to get, as a part of the master plan efforts, kind of some high-level costs for alternatives for meeting those requirements. And that'll, I think, in the big picture, help inform us about how we move forward. On the water side, when we decide to move forward with some of particularly the Nazi Recharge and Recovery project, that'll have a pretty significant impact. Even though we think we can cash flow the project, we're adding a lot of assets to the water list as that moves through. And the cost of operating that will be higher than other water sources. We have filtration there and some other other items that we've not operated previously, so our operating costs will go up once that's
Yeah, I mean, that's my concern. I mean, I do see a lot of maintenance and repair issues, significant repair issues that we need to do, like the blast wall and everything like that. So I just don't want to fall behind so much that all of a sudden we're looking at a huge rate increase versus if we catch it earlier, justify a smaller rate increase. So yeah, definitely that would be something that we want to keep in mind.
Yeah,
And especially also with not selling water units as much as we thought we would.
Yeah,
And we're getting
refunding them.
Yeah.
I think that's an important consideration too, is that's one of the reasons why we recommended we move forward with this elimination of the incentivized relinquishment program, is to sort of kind of true up how much money we have available to move forward with some projects, and again, maybe get a better sense of what our demand is. We've been putting all of our efforts, all of our financial efforts, towards improving the supply, and not necessarily other issues with the distribution system and whatnot that have been identified for many years. And there may be we may need to reset that a little bit through this completion of the master plan and prioritization of projects. Okay. The drainage fund, this page 42 is where the line items are, really straightforward. Here we have this very tiny little utility operation for storm drainage. It essentially maintains a very small amount of infrastructure surrounding two facilities, the Everest Park, where we have a drainage basin, and German Park, or what was originally known as the Bethel Road drainage area. And as you see, this is a tiny little operation. The challenge here is our current costs exceed revenues by about $4,800. We're burning down the balance. We just have a few, within a few more years, this could run into a situation where we'll have no choice but to bring additional resources into the drainage fund. I haven't done any recent research on whether or not there have been changes in the law that would allow us to be confident we can move forward with actually a rate increase. We do charge customers who surround these areas a small fee to be affiliated with them. Our costs are primarily a little tiny bit of the district engineer's time in preparing some annual reports and our asset replacement contribution. You can see the other costs are just, there's no supply costs or anything here. We're not allocating maintenance costs of, for example, the park facility or something like that to the drainage fund. But that's the circumstance that we're in. It's been in this situation for a long time, and we've been kind of burning down the available resources. And again, within a few years, it'll become a little more pressing. It's not a big dollar problem, but nonetheless, it's kind of headed our way. The admin fund, again, page 43 is the start of the description of the fund. 48 is the line items for it. This is primarily funded by transfer from other funds. The key revenue source is the transfer in from the it's labeled as CERBT. That's the trust that was set up for retiree medical services. That money coming in is tied to the district's hard costs for funding the retiree healthcare. The only other revenue sources are like rental of this room, which is not very frequently, and some interest on the balance and miscellaneous income, which is primarily some rebates and such from SDRMA. I do want to point out that again, this new line item of the UAL, this is a pretty significant departure. It's not a huge dollar this year, $83,000, but again, our historic practice has been to charge the UAL based on the number of current employees that were in those. We have six retirement. We essentially have 6 retirement programs. They're all numbers. I don't want to make it more complicated than it has to be, but it's awfully complicated for a tiny little agency like this, where we have 2 separate retirement programs through CalPERS, one for public safety, one for miscellaneous, and then under each of those systems there are 3 tiers. And we had the most significant UAL associated with tier 1, and tier 1 essentially closed back in 2012. So there's very few employees that remain in tier 1 that are with the district. Up until the current fiscal year, the UAL costs were divided amongst or allocated to the employee costs associated with each of those tiers. Again, for all practical purposes, all the meaningful UAL is associated with tier 1. And we knew this was already problematic. You established a goal to kind of rectify this and come up with a better way to allocate it. And we were doing some preliminary evaluation on that. And then lo and behold, PERS kind of quit providing us with information by tier. And so now we only get UAL by program, so miscellaneous or public safety, not by tier. So the way we've done this in the past, we cannot use information to even account for it that way. So it sort of forced our hand. This was kind of the way we proposed was sort of the way I was leaning anyways, which was to combine all the costs, just like we did with the OPEB, into admin and then spread them out amongst all the departments. It's far more equitable than what we've done more recently. And I'll give you an example. So about half the district's retirees that were in tier 1 worked in the utility, worked in water and wastewater. But water wastewater hasn't paid any tier 1 UAL for 6 years, perhaps, because all those folks have been retired, and so our prior way of allocating this didn't hit those funds. So by merging these costs into one area, all 6 groups or all 6 tiers or all 3 tiers for both programs into the admin fund, we're spreading the cost out throughout the district to all the funds that had previously benefited from or incurred those costs, including water and wastewater. So what this really does is provide a small savings to the fire fund and to Parks and Recreation Fund in particular, because they were previously paying hard costs towards the UAL, and now they're paying the administrative allocation of this portion. So it created a savings for the coming year, and I think it's a more equitable way. So anyhow, based on the lack of information from PERS, our options are fairly limited, but I think nonetheless we ended up in a good and more equitable spot. But it did drive up the admin cost pretty significantly. The other increases to the admin fund that are notable, one, legal services. I've increased the legal services line item because you've adopted a goal to issue to consider changes to the way legal services are provided to the district. In other words, maybe through an RFP process, selecting a legal team, perhaps a new legal team, and then the additional funds would allow for participation or attendance at board meetings in the second half of the fiscal year, should you elect to do that. We haven't made much progress on that particular goal, but nonetheless, there's now funding to support that if you brought on a new legal team and had them in attendance. And then our property liability insurance through SDRMA, this is not for just the admin fund, it's for the district as a whole. It's up pretty considerably, again, about $40,000, a little more than $40,000 over last year. About more than $50,000 over 2 years. So a pretty significant increase. The industry is just giving this just same issues that you have seen with your own homeowners insurance. Insurance costs in California are going up in a staggering way, and SDRMA is not immune from those issues. And then every time we add a vehicle, it drives our insurance costs up. Every time we add a facility, it drives our insurance costs up. We'll be adding, for example, facilities at the Platts River well. We'll be adding a new fire engine in several months. Those are gonna all increase it beyond what's shown here, because those are not yet factored in. So significant. As far as one-time line items that are notable, $4,275 is programmed to add a work order module to Tyler Technology software suite. That's our enterprise software. This is something that Justin and Natalie are more familiar with than I, but a system that we would use to track, regular work orders. Aside from, we use a system in Tyler right now to track service orders. That's really associated with customer accounts. This will be something that we can use for all of our district facilities and whatnot to track routine maintenance or even unexpected or repairs that are necessary.
Are you seeing the support increase cost in ongoing?
Yes. And
I think it was like $1,500 a year. But that part wasn't much, at least just the setup.
Two other line items. One, $5,000 is programmed in the admin fund for the district's 50th anniversary. This will fund two things. An ice cream giveaway on August 12th. That's the night we're doing the community celebration. And either shirts or jackets or something for staff and board in recognition of the 50th anniversary. And then $10,000 is programmed for the board election. If an election is held in November, we won't know until mid-August whether or not an election will be necessary after the nomination period closes. Again, reminder, 2 board seats open this year. Questions on the admin? Any questions on the admin? We're making great time. I'll slow down. All right, the fire fund. Starts on page 50. Line items actually begin on page 56. Just a few items to highlight. One, any grants that are received would require a budget amendment to reflect the revenue as well as any associated expenses. They're not already built in here. Although there are some grants that we know we'll consider applying for. So likely gonna be changes associated with those if they're awarded. The next item that's somewhat unique is the franchise fees, based on the board's decision in March. We've programmed the projected growth over last year's initial franchise fee revenue estimate to the fire fund. So it's that amount is estimated to be $35,000. So that line item is in the fire fund revenue. Not new, but as a reminder, any out of county revenue and expenses associated with supporting that would need to come by way of budget amendment. We have not programmed in here the expectation to participate. We have participated for each of the last, say, 5-6 years, and then before that as well. And I've dealt with those sort of after the fact. They're very difficult to know what the amount of money would be. And then keep in mind that without a reserve program, our participation options are a little bit more limited. We still think there are going to be opportunities to participate, but not as perhaps there'll be fewer times that we can participate based on the availability of our staff. And I just again remind you that that's because we've lost the reserves. The Measure A parcel tax is shown. Really, very few additional parcels expected to be assessed. So the main adjustment there is to the CPI, which is capped at 2%, based on Measure A. And then on the revenue side, I do want to point out that $32,046 is programmed as a transfer in from future fire operations. It's needed to offset what would otherwise be the expected deficit for the fire fund. And if you go back to page 8 on the supporting information sheet, you can see that we have right at our forecasted balance of the future fire operations is $514,000 July 1st. So that's where that money comes from. On the line item costs, items that I think that I wanted to kind of bring to your attention. Again, feel free to ask us any questions that you may have on any of these. Purchase service costs are up about $18,000, and it's really a couple of reasons. One is to fund newly required annual PPE inspections and cleaning by a third party. This happened for the first time just a few weeks ago, and it must have been a very thorough cleaning because it was a very loud truck. And as well as expenses associated with fireworks education and enforcement. On the fireworks enforcement side, I just do want to. So we have $10,000 allocated for a third party kind of aerial overwatch. That's part of the same fee structure that was built into the fireworks booths. And we are in contact with, or maybe not quite under contract, but have an arrangement pending with a company to provide aerial surveillance on either July 3rd or 4th.
We are on the schedule for July 3rd, and we are on the wait list for July 4th.
But we will not be able to fund both.
Yeah, so I've told them if something opens up on the 4th, because a lot of their clients are coastal communities, and if they get fogged in, they cancel, they can't fly anyways, they'll come up here.
One would be able to afford both.
They're $10,000 per day.
$10,000 an event.
Okay.
So like 4 hours is about
Have you heard
10,000.
from TNT at all in terms of their donation?
Yeah. I have a conference call with them tomorrow at 2:30.
So that doesn't, they do the donation, then we may be able to afford it then.
Both days?
Yeah, even with,
I don't believe so.
So we already included the donation revenue
Yeah.
under miscellaneous income.
Oh, you already
Here,
did
it's
that.
not above it.
oh, okay,
So we've accounted for the TNT donation as well as the booth fees in the, on the revenue. So
okay,
only if we got donations above and beyond what we're committed.
okay.
We would only be able to do one day. I mean, unless the fees or the fines were of such that it offset it.
We shouldn't have too much problem, hopefully.
Yeah, what it is, they were already committed, and so we may have to wait some time to either get until new capacity is created with these companies to get onto the fourth, because they've got essentially commitment, they're using up all their resources for
Yeah.
customers that have already been with
Yeah.
them.
And
And I reached out to them in March. And they were booked for the fourth.
yeah, and
I'm sorry, January.
Sheriff, was it at this meeting or tag meeting? I can't remember, that they did mention that they're gonna have drones in North County. So maybe hopefully we could get one in Templeton as well from the sheriff.
That's my understanding, that they will have a drone here. The problem is it doesn't have the same capabilities that this Arrow Watch
Oh,
has.
I see.
They cannot do the recording with the infrared and the zoom in feature that Overwatch has.
Hopefully.
But nonetheless, that'd be great if we can get the sheriff's department to do that, because then they can pursue their own
Yes,
enforcement. The sheriff's department, the county has the same essentially, because we mirrored their program ability to enforce in Templeton on their own, with their resources. So ideally that would occur.
Will we know what the price breakdown was between the cost for the PPE inspections versus the fireworks education and enforcement?
Say that, so the cost breakdown,
Yes, we have 18,000 allocated, and that includes PPE inspections and fireworks education and enforcement.
oh,
Yeah, what's our annual cost of the PPE work? It's about 5,000.
I'd have to get back to you on that, but I think I'm blanking on it right now.
I have
I'm-
written something like, was 175 times 14 sets, which is 2450, but then I have a note that it was 2 times a year.
Yeah, and we may not have to do the 2 times a year. I'm looking into that loophole in the state regulation, so. Maybe once a year. So that's right, it was about 5,000 for twice a year. And then if we can get away with once a year, be about 2,500. Those are rough numbers, and I can get you more detailed numbers.
Yeah, I'm just assuming that that would be useful information for our fireworks. No.
Yeah, we can report back at the conclusion of after the
Yeah.
season
Yeah,
about
yeah.
where our costs were.
Right.
Again, this Overwatch service is the big ticket item. It's $10,000 for one night of coverage, 1 4-hour session.
Yeah,
And
it's
so-
$2,500 an hour.
And that is, Overwatch is included in the 18?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's the bulk of that's more than half of that new cost right there.
and hopefully we get the education material out pretty soon.
Yeah, that's
That's what tomorrow's meeting is about. I'm waiting on a call back from our dispatch center, our dispatch battalion chief. They just need a phone number. I've given them all the information they need for our signs. But they want a contact phone number besides 911 for people to report illegal fireworks. So I need the best number from our dispatch center to be able to put on our boards. What they will actually be doing. What they will actually be doing is the side panels that are usually on the fireworks booths. They're taking their advertisement off of those and they're putting up the information for illegal fireworks. Who to call, where they're illegal, all of that kind of stuff on those side panels for the fireworks booths.
We have side panels and
Well, you better get some.
some do.
Are they paying for the,
They're doing it, so they'll probably add them.
are they paying for the printing?
They're paying for everything.
PMT is paying for it,
On those,
signage.
on the signage, yeah.
But we have 5,000 allocated in supplies for education, that's separate from,
That's separate from what they're doing, yeah. So if they provide enough, you may not have to use that.
Yeah.
But as it stands right now, we'll see what the conversation looks like tomorrow.
Yeah.
But as it stands right now, it looks like they're gonna cover the majority of all the social media, a video that will go on social media, indicating what the rules, requirements, and regulations, the difference between safe, insane, and illegal fireworks. What the fines are gonna be. I think there's a mapping portion. I mean, that goes to all the fireworks booths anyways. The problem is the majority of people, you know, discard that before they hit their car. And then, something else. Anyhow, so.
Oh, I'm just real quick on, as far as the amount that you transferring from our, due to the expected deficit, the 32,000. That's like, for me at least, as a board member, that's pretty much kind of my limit in terms of what I wanna see us take out of our, savings. So, hopefully next year, I don't know, if this number is larger next year, then we gotta, again, maybe get together and decide what we wanna do, but yeah, I hate to have this much money come out of our savings. This much, but I know we've lowered it because we've made some changes, but still. I was hoping it'd be lower, but it is, it is what it is, but hopefully next year we won't have to deal with like it's 60 or 70,000.
Additional, one-time expenses, about $100,000 is programmed to finish or to complete the purchase of supplies and equipment for the new engine. The board actually approved a budget amendment earlier this year, I think it was actually in March, to order the majority of those supplies, and they've been ordered, and some are already here and paid for. Others are still coming, and then there remain about $80,000 of items that we haven't yet ordered, that are necessary to complete the outfitting of that engine. Some of those items have already been ordered, but won't arrive until next year, until July or later, and so won't be paid for until July or later. So that's why some of the funds have been pushed into next year, but it's really about $80,000 of new equipment beyond what was already ordered. All of these items were identified and shared with the fire committee and the board a couple months ago.
Some of the lead times, like for example, on hose, has gone up to 20 weeks.
There's one replacement radio that's programmed. We had a need for, I think, 3, but got a grant to cover the cost of a couple of these. And then kind of a placeholder item. It was identified that about a $250,000 line item for what I've labeled as, interim fire station improvements, things that we need to consider putting in before we could, if the expansion is delayed long term. So we haven't yet done much. That's not a figure that's a placeholder or a budget level figure. We haven't identified or costed out the projects that would be included. Those items can come through the fire committee and obviously come back to the board once there's a concrete plan in place. So in this case, the revenues and transfers equal the expenditures and transfers, and that's because we've brought in just enough money to zero that out essentially. And again, just to like in the past several years, the budget has improved as the years gone on if we've participated in an out-of-county assignment. In other words, that has brought in more money than expenditures, and if that happens again, the situation can improve. It's just difficult to forecast. If we can participate at the level of participation. Again, it'll be a little more challenging than it has been. And even then, it's been challenging.
I can tell you, already this year, we had an opportunity to go down to Ventura. Now, we actually had our engine ready. There was a mistake by the county fire chief. I was in a meeting and didn't pick up his call right away. And within 7 minutes, he had dispatched another engine instead of us. So it was lost revenue on our part, but we had personnel ready, we were available to go and missed that opportunity, and I let him know about it.
On the CFD, it's the next fund, page 58, the line items are on page 61, very brief. So the growth in CFD revenue is not due to new assessments, but rather just an increase to the assessment amount. That has a 2% floor and a 6% ceiling, and if the CPI falls somewhere between, that's what the assessment has increased. So that's been factored in. We have some professional services associated with it. That's some consulting services to create the assessment role that the county uses to levy the assessment. A small amount of legal services, and then a tiny allocation of those admin expenses. It's not tiny, it's $600, but it's not $600. Then the net proceeds at $81,000 gets transferred into the future fire operating fund. And so the year that we're examining, the 26-27 fiscal year, what's expected to happen is the future fire operating fund would contribute about $32,000 to the fire operations, but gained about $81,000. So the net is about $49,000 growth in the future fire operating fund. So we actually end the year better off than we started in the future fire operating fund. However, that pattern won't continue indefinitely. In a couple of years, when the fire engine hits the district's books, we've already committed to using those funds to cover the additional asset replacement costs. So that was estimated to be about 80,000. It'll be a little bit less than that because some of these items that we're adding to the engine will be expensed. They're just supplies, and some of them, so it won't be a full $80,000, but it'll be most of that.
This is like, what, the 9th or 10th year of the CFD, isn't
It
it?
was formed in May of 2017. So
9 years,
yeah.
and we only got 81,000, 85,000. That's been disappointing. Oh, by now, it'll be enough.
Well, we thought it'd be $1 million at build out, but it's been slow growing for the last 6 or 7 years. Let's take like a 2-minute break.
Yeah, sure.
You could reason.
A cookie break.
Okay,
Thank
go
you.
ahead. All right, go ahead.
So the next fund is streetlights, page 62. The line items begin on page 65. Streetlight fund's interesting. I'll take a little more time in describing my observations. I have a captive audience. The streetlights fund is really two very distinct operations kind of pushed together. It funds general streetlights, which are Main Street and a few other locations in town that are property tax, fully funded by property taxes, tax supported. And then it also funds 4 lighting districts. Those are costs that are lighting programs that are in neighborhoods where there's an assessment to those neighborhoods for those lights, specifically for those neighborhoods. And the goal is to recapture all the district's costs associated with those 4 neighborhoods through the assessment. However, as it relates to those 4 assessments, once the districts incorporated the admin allocation and streetlight fund had to make a contribution, it ended up being this year about $8,700. When we reallocated those costs back to the 4 neighborhoods, it exceeded the maximum assessment amount. And that was determined at the very beginning when the streetlight fund was first formed. Its assessment was determined and there was a cost increase factor that had been applied. And so in a couple of cases, there is a small amount of money that is not fully recaptured by those assessment amounts. And that's simply because when the districts were formed by the district or the district accepted those assessment districts and approved the assessment allocation, it didn't include any overhead costs. And so we're not able to fully recapture that. So it's those, in the cases where there's a slight shortfall from those maximum assessment amounts, essentially the property taxes are paying that additional amount. Again, it goes back to our admin allocation cost. A little bit like the drainage fund, the property taxes that we've historically assigned plus the assessments do not meet the full needs of the fund. It's about $3,400 in the hole. That's the forecast for next year. But there's about $30,000 available in the fund balance. We can continue to cover this for some time, but as I mentioned, for many years, there will likely be a point in time when a small adjustment to the property tax allocation to streetlights will need to be considered. Parks and Recreation, last, certainly not least, page 66. The line items begin on page 73. First, there are some revenue changes that I want to kind of highlight. Franchise fees are essentially frozen based on the board's decision in March at $253,400. That was the amount that we originally anticipated last fiscal year. So that's what's programmed in. And this is detailed in a little more, this is shown in a little more detail on that summary fund balance page. We went back and added back the solid waste fund because now we've got money coming and kind of leaving that fund in 2 directions. And so the transfer into Parks and Recreation is shown or is broken down as is the remaining amount to the fire fund. And then the revenues associated with all the youth sports programs, we anticipated similar participation levels, or otherwise we're going to anticipate changes in participation levels, increase the registration fees by 10%. And so we increased the revenue for each of these by 8% to be a little conservative. We don't really know what the impacts of that initial rate fee hike will be. Hopefully we beat this by a few bucks in cases, but that's how we went about it for the budget development. On the expense side, fairly routine. The biggest change from not the end of it.
Just before, I was gonna ask Mel, since we've already put in the increases, have you seen, how is that going? Is there problems or?
Not yet. Soccer is the first one and it just opened on May 1st. So it's kind of early on in the process for that. But
So far it's been, okay, thank you.
As far as the one-time expenses, a few items and one I want to make sure you have a good handle on. That's the first one here. There's a $7,500 line item to process a lot line adjustment for Evers Park. And this is something a problem that's been known for actually 30 some years. And we've been dealing with on a financial side for a dozen or so years. The park's boundary, it's kind of complicated, but the driveway to the park is actually not on our property, but rather kind of an easement to the neighbor's property. And then the park lot itself, the fence line doesn't match the property boundary. And this is of a particular issue on the southwest corner. It's not an area that actually anybody would think is part of the park. It's kind of above the parking lot. The district's property goes up and over this very steep slope onto what most people would assume is a resident's backyard. And the backyard is about 3 times larger than it would otherwise be. And this has been this case for like maybe 40 years or something. And been known to both us and the property owner. And the issue over the past decade or so has been, there's a tree that is a large tree that is that sits on the property line. Most of it's on the district's property, but a little bit of it's on the resident's property. And the resident, the property owner anyway, has requested participation in tree trimming. And so we've evaluated our options, and we have an obligation to maintain this tree. And so we've been paying for this tree trimming on every several year basis, and the tree trimming gets more and more expensive. And the tree is of little benefit to the public. I mean, it's, yes, it looks pretty from a distance, but it isn't like you can go take a picnic under there because it's in someone's backyard. After reviewing some options, we briefed the Parks and Rec Committee, Parks Recreation and Refuse Committee earlier this year and discussed our options, and one of which was to actually just amend the property line so that the resident's property matches the fence line. The district gets out of the obligation to continue to maintain this tree and perhaps reduces our liability if something were to happen on that property. And that property owner, the committee gave us sort of direction, like, let's continue down that path, see if it makes some sense. And that property owner has, at least thus far, been open to that concept. So we've budgeted funds to hire a surveyor and process the property line to make the property lines match the fence lines and get us out of that maintaining the tree obligation. So that's that line item.
Watch is gonna cut the tree down. It's basically cut the tree down.
Well, and then they would be incurring that cost of cutting that tree down, because that tree would cost probably this amount or more. And so far, she's never been willing, because that's been something that I pushed for, and more recently Justin's pushed for, is like, let's just end this, like get out of the tree trimming business. But the problem is, probably 50 years ago, that tree was solely on what would have been our property. Probably didn't own it then, but since the tree has grown and it now grows over the property line, and it's essentially a joint responsibility. And we haven't got permission from the county to actually cut the tree. The tree is actually pretty healthy. It just happens to be a really big tree next to a duplex. It overhangs the duplex. It's like pretty darn close. It's a big tree pretty close to the house. So anyhow, that's the concept, is that we would end the obligation of maintaining that tree, and so in the long term, it would cost savings. Other line items or one-time expenses that are programmed, $2,500 for a couple of benches at the skate park, replacing what are damaged, damaged benches. Picnic tables. I think the concept is two new picnic tables would go to German Park, and the 2 existing German Park picnic tables would go to the skate park. 2 new soccer goals. I believe those will also be at German Park. Those are partly, or maybe more than partly, paid for by donations from the soccer board. From their money primarily comes from running the snack bar. $5,400 is programmed for consulting service support in preparation for bid documents and the bidding process for the Evers Park Improvement Project. Just note or keep in mind that if that project does move forward, budget adjustment would be necessary to actually proceed to deal with the construction itself and the costs associated with supporting that construction. There'd be some special inspections and other things in addition to the contractor. And a $30,000 line item is programmed for renovating the restrooms at Evers Park. We had a line item in here this year of $20,000 for both Evers and German Park, and then we hired a certified accessibility specialist to evaluate the restrooms and in order to improve the ADA compliance, the work is more extensive at both parks. At Everest Park, I think it means that the restrooms kind of perform the same way they do now, but just be more ADA compliant. We'll have to move around some locations of some equipment and some partitions, et cetera. And so we've increased the budget to accommodate that. And then at German Park, the solution is a bit more complicated. We really cannot continue to have the same kind of occupancy and still achieve near ADA compliance at German Park. And so the thought is something kind of different to turn those restrooms into single occupant restrooms, removing some of the fixtures to open up space. And so that would be done at a later date, and it's not included in this $30,000. So revenues for Parks and Rec and transfers exceed expenditures by about 55,000 in the current year. But I want to caution you against looking at that as a surplus, a going forward surplus. If the Everest Park Improvement Plan commences with construction, we're going to get hit with a new operational expense associated with not only just the asset replacement alone would be nearly $50,000 a year going forward, and then likely some other operational costs in supporting the expanded facility. We're going to have new materials to maintain park at the playground and things of that nature. So
How is the asset replacement going to be 50,000?
well,
If we spend $1 million, isn't it over 4 years?
Depends on how the asset's booked, right? So each asset that's listed would have a different depreciation curve, but this project is going to be well more than $1 million.
Well, we can't afford one.
Well, we've got about $1.4 million with the grant funds available.
Even I thought if it's over 40 years, that'd be, I guess, if it's 2 million.
2 million over 40 years is 50 grand, but some of the improvements, like the long-term improvements, like the concrete work and stuff is probably a 40-year life, but a playground facility doesn't have a 40-year life. It'll have a shorter depreciation schedule. Perhaps 20 years. And landscaping is gonna be, shorter as well. So anyway,
It's not for landscaping.
anything that's booked as an asset.
Yeah, that's the thing with asset replacement, it hits you twice, when he's in there.
Anyhow, so that's the end of the items that I had prepared. I didn't hear any requests to make any adjustments. Line items or any items. This went pretty quick.
Natalie won the bet.
Fastest review we've ever had.
Well, we got a great staff, so that's why. You guys make us look clear and understanding. So we appreciate it. Thank you for all the hard work. I know a lot of work goes into this, both to the committee as well as all the staff members, Natalie and Jeff and all the managers that were involved with coming up with this plan. We appreciate it. So, thank you. All right. Is that it?
That's it.
And no more comments? Everything good? You guys good? Everyone good? All right. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.